Stand on the eastern bank of the Nile, around 3500 BCE, and look west. The river is familiar. Almost everything beyond it is not. There is no Great Pyramid, no Sphinx, no monumental temple, no pharaoh whose name will survive for thousands of years. Across the water, the future Giza Plateau is only a pale desert ridge above green fields. Mud brick villages sit close to the Nile. Farmers work dark flood soil. Fishing boats move through reeds. Cattle graze near the water. And every person here depends on one force no king will ever completely control: the Nile. Keep watching. Scattered communities will become one kingdom. Writing will record taxes and royal power. Simple graves will become enormous monuments. Then, directly across from us, an artificial mountain will rise, the Great Pyramid. But that is only the beginning. Egypt will collapse and reunite. Foreign kings will control the north. Egyptian armies will build an empire beyond the Nile Valley. A forgotten boy king will become famous thousands of years after his death. Ramesses the Great will cover Egypt with his image. Then, Egypt will weaken. Libyan rulers will rise. Alexander the Great will arrive. Greek rulers will inherit the throne. And finally, Cleopatra will face the power of Rome. The Nile will rise. The Nile will fall. Kings will disappear. Dynasties will collapse, but the pyramids will remain. This is the evolution of ancient Egypt. The eastern side of the Nile, looking west toward the future Giza Plateau. The river remains in the foreground. Beyond it lies fertile agricultural land. Farther west, green fields suddenly meet desert. The battle in Nubia, or every temple built at Thebes, royal boats, stone shipments, tax collectors, priests, soldiers, foreign traders, victory processions, and eventually, foreign armies. The Nile becomes our timeline, because before Egypt is a kingdom, it is a river civilization. Each year, the Nile rises. Water spreads across the valley, then retreats and leaves fertile soil behind. People raise cattle, catch fish, weave linen, and make pottery. Villages grow. Trade increases. To the east is desert. To the west is desert. Between them runs a narrow corridor of life. That geography connects communities. Boats travel along the Nile more easily than people cross the surrounding deserts. Goods move. Ideas move. Competition grows. By the late pre-dynastic period, powerful centers emerge in Upper and Lower Egypt. Local rulers compete for territory and resources. Their symbols become increasingly elaborate. Writing begins to appear. Then, around 3100 BCE, centuries of competition produce something revolutionary: one kingdom. Later Egyptians will describe their country as two lands, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Now both come under one kingship. Narmer is closely associated with this transformation, although unification was probably a process rather than one single battle. What matters is what follows. Officials travel the Nile, scribes record goods, taxes become organized, royal authority spreads. The king becomes more than a political ruler. He is presented as the protector of cosmic order. That idea will survive almost every transformation that follows. Centuries pass. Royal tombs grow larger. At Saqqara, King Djoser orders something extraordinary: a massive burial complex built largely from stone. At its center rises the Step Pyramid. Egypt has discovered monumental stone architecture. Then King Snefru pushes pyramid building further. His engineers experiment. One pyramid changes angle during construction. Another achieves the smooth-sided form future kings will copy. Then Snefru's son becomes king, Khufu. Now look at the empty Giza Plateau directly across the river. Around 2550 BCE, the horizon begins changing. Surveyors arrive. Quarries open, roadways and ramps appear. Boats carry limestone. Thousands of workers gather, and slowly, layer by layer, the Great Pyramid rises, higher, wider, more enormous than anything humans have constructed before. The project requires national organization: stonecutters, haulers, boat crews, bakers, brewers, craftsmen, administrators. Entire communities support the work. Workers are housed, fed, and organized in rotating crews. Food, copper tools, rope, timber, and stone all move through a carefully managed system. Eventually, the pyramid receives smooth white limestone casing. Under the Egyptian sun, it shines far brighter than the weathered monument we know today. Khufu dies, but Giza is not finished. Khafre builds another pyramid, then Menkaure. Temples appear, causeways cross the plateau. Elite tombs spread around the royal complexes. The Great Sphinx rises near Khafre's monuments. Within generations, the empty ridge becomes one of history's greatest sacred landscapes. Everything else will change. Governments, clothing, weapons, languages, foreign rulers. But these pyramids remain in the frame. Then, Old Kingdom power begins to weaken. Provincial officials become stronger. Central authority declines. Periods of poor Nile flooding may add economic pressure. Egypt enters the first intermediate period. The pyramids do not collapse. The government does. Different rulers compete for control, yet everyday Egyptian life continues. Farmers still plant. Boats still move. Priests still perform rituals. Families still bury their dead. A state can collapse without a civilization disappearing. Eventually, rulers based at Thebes push north. Egypt reunites. Around 2030 BCE, Mentuhotep II restores political unity. A new age begins. Administration strengthens, trade expands. Egypt pushes farther south into Nubia. Royal building returns. Pyramids are constructed again, although many contain mud brick cores and survive far less dramatically than the stone monuments at Giza. Fortresses rise along the southern frontier. Expeditions move toward gold, stone, and trade routes. The state is powerful again. Royal art changes too. Some kings appear with heavier faces and serious expressions, as if kingship itself carries more weight. The Middle Kingdom becomes powerful and prosperous, but unity weakens again, and this time, rulers from outside Egypt gain control over much of the north. In the eastern Nile Delta, rulers later called the Hyksos establish power. They are connected with populations from Western Asia who had already lived and traded in the region. Northern Egypt is no longer controlled by Thebes. Horse-drawn chariots and composite bows become increasingly important in warfare. Egypt is divided again, but southern rulers fight back. Eventually, Ahmose I defeats the Hyksos and reunites Egypt around 1550 BCE. This time, Egypt's kings adopt a different strategy. Do not simply defend the Nile Valley. Push outward. Control threats before they reach Egypt. The result is the New Kingdom, and Egypt becomes an empire. Egyptian armies campaign deep into Nubia and Western Asia. Gold, tribute, and foreign delegations flow north. Thebes becomes one of the great religious centers of the ancient world. Karnak grows generation after generation. The god Amun becomes enormously powerful. Our pyramids at Giza are now already more than 1,000 years old. Even New Kingdom Egyptians see them as monuments from a distant past. Royal burial changes. Kings stop building enormous visible pyramids. Instead, they hide their tombs inside the cliffs near Thebes. The wealth of empire now pours into temples, palaces, and military campaigns rather than giant pyramid projects. Then, one of Egypt's most unusual rulers takes power. Hatshepsut begins as regent for the young Thutmose III. Then, she assumes full royal authority, not simply as a queen, as pharaoh. Her monuments increasingly show her using the traditional symbols of kingship. Her reign emphasizes trade, building, and religious legitimacy. Expeditions travel to Punt and return with incense, exotic goods, and precious materials. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri becomes one of Egypt's architectural masterpieces. After her death, Thutmose III becomes a powerful military ruler. Egyptian influence extends far into Western Asia. For a time, Egypt controls an empire. But the next great disruption will not come from an invading army. It will come from inside the palace. Amenhotep IV becomes Akhenaten. He elevates the Aten, represented by the sun disk, above Egypt's traditional religious establishment. The influence of Amun is attacked. Then, Akhenaten builds an entirely new royal city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna. The court moves there. Temple design changes. Royal art changes. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their children appear beneath rays of the Aten in images unlike traditional Egyptian royal scenes. For a civilization that values continuity, the transformation is extraordinary. But it does not survive Akhenaten. After his death, the court abandons the new capital. Traditional gods return. A young king, originally called Tutankhaten, changes his name to Tutankhamun. During his short life, he is not Egypt's most important ruler. Thousands of years later, the discovery of his nearly intact tomb will make him the most famous pharaoh of all. Then comes Ramesses II. He rules for about 66 years, long enough for generations to know no other king. His statues appear across the country. His name covers monuments. His building program is enormous. His reign includes the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. Later, Egypt and the Hittites establish peace. At Abu Simbel, colossal statues of Ramesses sit before temples cut into rock. Everywhere, the message is clear: power must be visible. But monuments cannot stop larger changes. After Ramesses II, Egypt faces increasing pressure. The Eastern Mediterranean enters upheaval. Egypt fights groups its records describe among the Sea Peoples. The kingdom survives, but royal authority weakens. Economic problems increase. Workers at Deir el-Medina even stop working when their food rations are delayed, one of history's earliest recorded labor strikes. By around 1070 BCE, the New Kingdom ends. Egypt survives. Its empire does not. Political power fragments again. Some rulers have Libyan ancestry. Then kings from Kush, south of Egypt and Nubia, move north. They conquer Egypt and establish the 25th dynasty. The Kushite rulers present themselves as legitimate pharaohs. They embrace Egyptian religious traditions and deliberately revive older styles. For a time, Egypt and Kush are united beneath one crown. Then another great power approaches: Assyria. Assyrian armies invade repeatedly. Thebes is eventually sacked. Kushite control ends. Later, rulers based at Sais reunite much of Egypt. Trade with the Mediterranean expands. Greek and Carian soldiers serve Egyptian kings. Egypt is still unmistakably Egyptian, but it is now part of a much more interconnected world. Then Persia arrives. In 525 BCE, the Persian king, Cambyses II, defeats Egypt. The country becomes part of the vast Achaemenid Empire. Persian kings adopt Egyptian royal titles. Some support Egyptian temples. But resistance continues. Egypt briefly regains independence under native dynasties. Nectanebo II becomes the final native Egyptian ruler before Persia conquers the country again. For thousands of years, kings born within Egyptian traditions dominated the throne. Now, foreign empires increasingly decide who rules the Nile. And then, in 332 BCE, another conqueror arrives. Alexander enters Egypt. Persian control collapses. He is accepted as ruler. Near the Mediterranean coast, he establishes Alexandria. The center of Egypt's political world begins moving toward the Mediterranean. Alexander soon dies. His empire fragments. One of his generals, Ptolemy, takes control of Egypt. In 305 BCE, he becomes Ptolemy I. A Macedonian Greek dynasty now occupies the throne of the pharaohs. Yet ancient Egyptian culture does not suddenly disappear. The Ptolemies build temples dedicated to Egyptian gods. On temple walls, they appear dressed as traditional pharaohs. Greek and Egyptian communities live within the same kingdom. The two cultures interact and blend. Alexandria becomes one of the great cities of the Mediterranean world, while ancient temples farther south continue receiving royal attention. Egypt is changing again, without completely replacing what came before. Eventually, one ruler comes to represent the dynasty's final chapter: Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra takes the throne in a wealthy Egypt, increasingly dominated by Roman politics. She inherits a kingdom with ancient religious traditions, Greek-speaking elites, major Mediterranean trade, and enormous strategic importance. But independence now depends on decisions made far beyond the Nile. Cleopatra first allies herself with Julius Caesar, later with Mark Antony. Then, Rome's internal struggle turns against them. In 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra's forces are defeated at Actium. The following year, Octavian's forces enter Alexandria. Antony dies. Cleopatra dies. In 30 BCE, Egypt becomes part of the Roman world. The Ptolemaic dynasty ends. Nearly 3,500 years have passed. Now look west again. The Great Pyramid still stands. Khafre's pyramid still stands. Menkaure's pyramid still stands. They have already survived for more than 2,000 years. Think about everything they have watched. Egypt united. Egypt divided. Egypt reunited. Foreign rulers controlled the north. Egypt became an empire. A pharaoh challenged the gods. Dynasties disappeared. Kushite rulers became pharaohs. Assyrians invaded. Persians conquered. Greeks took the throne. Rome arrived. And through every transformation, Egyptian life still depends on the Nile. That is the hidden story of ancient Egypt. Its stone appears permanent. Its history was constantly changing. It watched writing turn resources into administration. It watched tombs become pyramids. It watched Khufu's monument rise until it dominated the horizon. It watched the Old Kingdom collapse. It watched Egypt reunite. It watched foreign Hyksos rulers control the north. It watched Amoza drive them out. It watched Egypt become an empire. It watched Hatshepsut rule as pharaoh. It watched Akhenaten challenge centuries of religion. It watched Tutankhamun restore tradition. It watched Ramesses II try to make his image immortal. It watched the empire weaken. It watched Kushite kings revive Egyptian traditions. It watched Assyrians invade. It watched Persian kings become pharaohs. It watched Alexander enter Egypt. It watched Greek rulers worship Egyptian gods. And finally, it watched Rome absorb one of the oldest states in human history. But our camera also watched something no king truly commanded: the Nile. Pharaohs could raise armies. They could quarry mountains. They could build temples. They could carve their names into stone. But they still depended on water. A weak flood could mean hunger. A good flood could mean abundance. The river supported farmers. Farmers supported the state. And the state supported the monuments we now mistake for the civilization itself. Ancient Egypt was never built by stone alone. It was built by ordinary lives moving through the rhythm of the river. Farmers, boatmen, stonecutters, scribes, bakers, brewers, priests, soldiers, craftsmen, families whose names never entered royal history. They harvested grain while dynasties changed. They loaded boats while armies marched. They repaired canals while priests performed rituals. Kings changed, borders changed, religious power changed, languages changed. Empires arrived and disappeared. The Nile continued moving north. The river outlived every throne. Look at the pyramids one final time. By Cleopatra's lifetime, the Great Pyramid was already more than 2,000 years old. It was ancient even to her, and still it stood. That is why our fixed camera matters. Every ruler believes the present is permanent. Khufu did, Ramesses did, the Persians did, the Ptolemies did. Rome would too. But history keeps moving. Ancient Egypt was never one civilization frozen for 3,000 years. It was repeatedly united, divided, conquered, restored, and reinvented. Through every transformation, the Nile remained the line connecting one Egypt to the next. 3,500 years, one river, one horizon, countless versions of Egypt. And the river keeps moving beyond them. Subscribe for more fixed camera journeys through the rise, collapse, and reinvention of the world's greatest civilizations. And tell us in the comments, which civilization should we watch evolve next?